know, I have posted the exam on Blackboard. So you should have access to it there. I'll give you a hard copy.
Do we submit it on Blackboard?
No, just by email as an attachment.
Do you actually want us to,
Yeah.
since us three are actually in your class next Tuesday too for coffee, you want us
Oh,
to
right.
make a paper copy?
Oh, that'd be dandy. Yeah, yeah. Bring it in as a paper copy. Okay, this Thursday, if you want to. You know, in terms of the timing of it, I always kind of, you're always back and forth, trying to make sure that the exam is fair and tests your knowledge of the material. That's what I'm looking for here. And with a take-home exam, we have a week here. I think I mentioned this before. You shouldn't be working on this nonstop between now and then, and there's a lot of other things coming up. In terms of the actual process of sitting down and writing the exam, what you have here are 2 essay questions. Pardon me? Okay, there you go. You got your, first thing is to make your pick, but you're on there. Normally in this exam, there would be an identification section and the essay section, and I'd ask you to write both, obviously, with 1 essay as opposed to 2. With those evenly weighted here, there's no identification. We just have the essay, so there are 2 of them. But realistically, 3 hours worth of writing should be enough, plus the preparation that you normally make for the exam. With that preparation being tailored focus to the essay questions that you're writing because you know what they are. Yeah? So all of the questions identify certain authors. So I would suggest you go back and have a targeted reading of those authors that you select, that you go back through your notes and my notes that are available on Blackboard, and I'll refresh at the library there. Is anyone going to the library? Is anyone?
I only went around, I forget when it was, but I like your notes. I like printing them off and keeping them.
Okay.
For the semester or mid.
Yeah.
I went to mid already. And then I'll be going again when we finalize this semester.
What I like that Arlene, the librarian there, puts them in the binder and the pages are all numbered, and then I get that at the end and I say, hey, there's that course for that particular year. I'll try to do that after class here and get them. If not today, then tomorrow for sure. I'll get them at the library. But everything's up on Blackboard, including this. So yeah, targeted preparation. Always, this should be the case for any essay. In my view, the first thing you need to do is anticipate what's going to be on the exam. Kind of mock that up. Here you actually have it, so it's easier in that regard. But I think it would be kind of fruitless at this point to go through all of the course materials. You should know these things already. You've read these things already. It would be daunting, impossible, nigh on impossible to reread the whole course, in the 11th hour here. If you've kept up, you should be feeling good about your progress and prepared to write. I think people sometimes put themselves in a little bit of a tizzy at this point in the season and do things that aren't helpful to the cause, like all-nighters. I don't see any benefit, to be honest with you, in staying up all night studying or writing essays. We know, this is more from the sports science side of things, but we know that people do not perform well when they're sleep deprived. The easiest thing you can do to put yourself in the right frame of mind to write exams or essays is to have your 8 hours, maybe that seems like a little much, 6, 7, at least hours of sleep is probably better than staying up all night rereading course materials. Yeah.
So for this exam, do you want quotes and references?
Yeah. You have access to, it's open book. You have access to the primary sources. Yeah, make reference to the primary sources. It's available to you. I just need to fix this. Yeah, well, the expectation here is twofold. One, that you answer the question, and 2, that you make reference to the primary sources. That's what I'm looking for. The course is about the origins of international relations. We're looking at primary sources, canonical sources from the discipline, so that you're aware of the discipline of international relations. first and foremost. I think I mentioned this in the first class. You know, we're talking about the study of international relations. Obviously, we're using examples from international relations, both contemporary and historical, to kind of populate those theories, but we're looking at the theories here. So you need to know these authors. So that's what I'm looking for in this exam. Do you know these authors? Can you explain their ideas in your own words? Yeah. So maybe we should take a look at this. Have it in hand. Those of you who are online, feel free to reach out and ask any questions that you may have. So this is a take-home exam.
How many pages do you have to check?
Yeah.
You want like 5 pages for an essay?
There is no page length requirement here. I'm expecting that you answer the question and show that you understand the authors. That's what I'm looking for here.
That's what would be expected in an exam anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Answer the question.
And you know, in a written exam, it's harder because some people have big handwriting, some people have little. I mean, this is not a hard expectation, but it's something like 3 to 4 pages each, something in that neck of the woods there. It would be, I think, fairly realistic to write 2 of those in the course of 3 hours. Not necessarily all at once, you know, you can break it up a little bit, but yeah, 3 hours of sitting down and writing once you've done your preparation, once you've done your targeted readings, have an outline, you know, and then write it, and then perhaps come back, give yourself time to set it aside, come back and do some editing after that. But 3 hours of writing is probably enough. So this is due in a week. So next Tuesday, December 7th at 12 noon. And yeah, you folks can hand it in because we will be seeing each other. What time is our class next Tuesday? Is it 12:30? Okay, okay. I'm assuming so. I haven't really looked. Oh, okay. I'm just trying to think. Fair enough. Yeah, there's not a lot of traffic around here. Did you get any notice on that in terms of the makeup day? I don't think I did either. No. Mm-hmm. I'll look back in my records there. That was way back in September now at this point. In any case, yeah, we'll see each other next week, so you can give me a hard copy then. Otherwise, an email attachment, either Word or PDF is fine, sent to my email address there. So let's go through these essay questions. And yeah, if you have any questions about the questions, feel free at this point. The exam is worth 40% of the final grade, and it's broken down just for the ease of not having to be involved in rounding things up or down. 20 marks for each of the 2 questions. They will add up to 40 marks total, which will constitute the 40% of your final grade. First question, why do empires expand? So again, make sure you answer the question if you choose that one. And answer in terms of security, making reference to Thucydides, and in terms of economic interests, referring to Hobbes and Lenin. The 2 texts that we have on the reading list for that topic. And again, there's, I think, abundant notes on Blackboard and at the library on Hobson and Lenin in that regard. Second question, this is a really straightforward one. We've spent a lot of time thinking and talking about this. Compare and contrast the idealist and realist positions on the conditions necessary for peace among nations. What are the conditions that must pertain in order for there to be peace among nations? Make reference to Hobbes, Morgenthau, Wilson, and Kant. Yeah.
I have a question about this one. In my other class, we did this where we what we chose for realism and idealism. And I had chosen one, and so my paper, I'm just worried, is there any issue with my paper if it's making references to the same authors, or if it's okay because there's answers to these questions that they're looking for. So if the answer is the answer, it's just the answer, right?
As long as your writing is unique to each of the 2 assignments. So you can't take the same writing from one exam and submit it to another. Yeah.
I'm willing to do that, but it's just that over on that paper, it's crossing.
Yeah, you know, it should help you out, really. If you've been thinking about it already in one class, and it's a really formative concept or division within the discipline, idealist and realist. Excuse me. So it makes sense that it's coming up again here. Just so long as the words on the page, the writing is unique to each of those, you should be fine. Yeah. And there you have two realists, Hobbes and Morgenthau. You have two idealists, Woodrow Wilson and Kant. We actually talked more about Kant in the other class than in this one, but we did spend a fair bit of time at the beginning on Wilson's speech, 14-point speech. So you have, again, an abundance of notes to reflect on there. The third question actually includes some passages from George W. Bush and from Henry Kissinger. Just read through this. This is germane to our discussion last week and actually to what we're talking about today. This is President George W. Bush speaking to graduates at West Point. This is his West Point speech. For much of the last century, America's defenses relied on the Cold War doctrines of deterrence and containment. What can anyone remind us of what those concepts are? Deterrence and containment. What does Bush mean by that?
Stopping Soviets by forming alliances to make them not attack, and keeping Soviets contingent on the field of diplomacy.
That's part of it, yeah. In terms of deterrence, what do we mean by deterrence? What is the idea at play there? Yeah.
Even though if you were not making any war engagement being too high cost people.
Yeah. The cost of using military force is so high that the party is deterred by the consequences. So if you attack us with nuclear weapons, we'll attack you with nuclear weapons. Mutually assured destruction is an example of deterrence. Containment was the effort to limit the Soviets to their sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and not allow them to go any further, to contain that potential threat. Cold War doctrines. In some cases, those strategies still apply, but if we're dealing with states. But new threats also require new thinking. Deterrence, the promise of massive retaliation against nations, means nothing against shadowy terrorist networks with no nation or citizens to defend. So if networks are not responsible to their citizenry or to a population or territory, if they have no return address, it will be difficult to deter them. Again, not suffering any real consequences. Containment is not possible when unbalanced dictators with weapons of mass destruction can deliver those weapons on missiles or secretly provide them to terrorist allies. The curious aspect of this, of course, is that the concern in mind here is Iraq, Iran, North Korea acquiring these weapons and spreading them to other states, whereas it was an American ally, Pakistan, and the Khan network that was responsible for proliferating nuclear weapons technology to Libya and North Korea. American ally did that, not this axis of evil. In any case, our security will require transforming the military you will lead, a military that must be ready to strike at a moment's notice in any dark corner of the world. There are no clear battle lines to this war on terror. It could be anywhere. Attacks can occur center to center, as Cohen remarks in his essay from today's readings. And our security will require all Americans to be forward-looking and resolute, to be ready for preemptive action. This is the centerpiece of the Bush Doctrine, to attack threats before they are fully formed, when necessary to defend our liberty and to defend our lives. Again, making preemptive defense into a centerpiece of American foreign policy. The world has changed. Our defense strategy has changed also. And then this line from Henry Kissinger from 1975. The world has become increasingly interdependent in economics, in communications, in human aspirations. Two statements that indicate similar concepts here in terms of the threats that are facing the territorial state. So I ask, analyze and expand upon these two assessments of contemporary global politics. Reflect on those primary sources. Do some exegesis there. How has the place of power changed under conditions of globalization? How has the place of power changed under conditions of globalization? Your answer should make reference to the 2002 National Security Strategy of the United States, Robert Cohen, Joseph Nye, Hertz, and Ignatieff. You've got a long list of authors there to make reference to. Part of the aim in this question is to test sort of the breadth of knowledge of the materials. And then finally, question D. So we have 4 questions here. I'm asking you to choose 2. Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War is often described as the original work of realism. I've tried to make the argument to you that that's kind of a very narrow reading, misappropriation of Thucydides. One thing I'll say about the discipline of international relations is it's a relatively young discipline. Really it's a young discipline. International relations, this study that we're engaged in, really came to prominence after the end of the Second World War. Prior to that, we have something like diplomatic history more so than this theorization of why states do the things that they do. And this was more my sort of reflection on being a graduate student studying international relations and political theory. The IR scholars kind of tend to glaze over the history of political thought in a casual kind of way. So it's not unusual to see an IR scholar draw out the Millian Dialogue in that statement, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, as if it were representative of the whole of Thucydides' thought, whereas it's really only reflective of the Athenian position in that particular debate. I kind of chuckled at one point, not to disparage my IR colleagues, but there are different disciplines. I recall one colleague saying, we're talking about Thucydides, we're talking about Hobbes and so on, and he said, yeah, I'm going to get to those books, I'm going to read them over the summer. I said, well, no, actually, you'd spend years reading, you could spend a whole semester reading Thucydides, getting deep and involved into it. And I think that's the benefit of the kind of treatment that you've become accustomed to now. You've got a deeper understanding of the text, I think, than many do. So make specific reference to the Melian debate and other selections from History of the Peloponnesian War if you choose, and describe the ways in which the book can be described as both idealist and realist. What are the idealist dimensions of the Melian debate? I would associate those with the position taken by Milos. And what are the realist arguments that are made associated with the position taken by Athens there?
What other assignments do we have before this final?
So you had the proposal and the essay, basically, yeah. Yeah, it was a pretty simple listen, and I'd be interested to know your perspective at the end of things here. It's a short list of assignments, an essay proposal, an essay, and an exam. Is that enough? Would you have wanted more? Okay, there was a quick answer there. Because that's a question that occurs to me, like how many assignments do we need? I tend to want you to spend some time with these pieces of writing. They're not just sort of quick, in-the-moment responses to a post made on Blackboard or something like that. They're more involved. I'm asking you to compose your thoughts, have a structure, have a thesis, have an argument. So I've given you a little more time. That said, it places more weight upon each of those assignments. I think it's 20, 40, and 40 in terms of the percentage breakdown. So the stakes are a little higher. There are less low-stakes assignment in this particular course. Now that said, normally the way this course would be broken down would be 10% for the proposal, 10% for participation, and then 40 and 40 for the exam and for the essay. Hard to do participation when much of the class isn't here, so that's why things were a little bit different this time around. But anyways, interested in your thoughts. Do you appreciate more assignments, or is kind of waiting the end of the semester? And it does weight the tail end of the semester more than the front end of the semester in terms of where the grades come in.
Well, for me, it's for myself and my experience, I am learning, the authors that are being introduced. I've never read them before, so it gives me time to
Mm.
It's hard sometimes, like, unfortunately, like, I rely heavily on the class, like, in instruction,
Mm.
in my classes, and how we talk about them. That's like the most important part of this whole entire field for me, is being in class, and the classes are, so we have so many, so we, like, for me, I focus in on the class time, and that's my work time, and I do the lesson time, and, the papers, um, it's nice to have some experience in the class to be able to write a paper after. Rather, if I had so many assignments in the beginning, I don't know what I'm talking about yet. Like, I'm
Mm.
still trying to understand what these concepts are. If I don't even get to like this, I just add into it. It takes me time. So at the end, I feel like I could write something finally. And say,
Oh,
well,
good.
now I don't feel so much stress because I feel we've gone over a lot of things. We
Mm.
talked about it not just once, not just twice, but sometimes over and over.
Mm.
And it's like, okay, yeah, now I remember what this is. And even at the end, I'm still like, what does that mean again? And then I have to look at it. Like, reload that class. And I'll ask the question, like, what does that mean again in the
Yeah,
class?
yeah. That's helpful. Yeah, if the concepts become more familiar, is then you make the ideas your own by saying them out loud. And you mentioned also the reading dimension of the course. The selections have been rather short. It is a survey course, so we don't do any deep dives into one author or another. But there's a fair breadth of material to move through there. I've taught other courses at like Colorado College, nice little liberal arts college in Colorado Springs, and they're on a block program there. So I think it was 3 weeks per course where you just study one course, but every day you're with the class, with the prof studying that one course. And it's helpful for these kinds of discussions, hard for the reading. Here you've got a week between to keep up on the readings, and that is the substance of what we're after. Anyways, that's helpful to know. I'm always interested to analyze, and we didn't get, what I don't have, are any course evaluations.
I think they're online.
Are they?
Yeah.
Oh, do you get them, or how does that work? I don't even know.
Just log in the Blackboard. Yeah. We got an email from Blackboard. I think starting last week, and then they email us reminders.
Oh, okay.
But I think they're just directly on.
Oh, okay.
Microsoft, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, it just occurred to me that normally I would have a stack of those and we'd do them at the end of class, and I never received them, and I thought, geez, did I miss something here? So I'm glad those got to you. But I haven't heard any news about that either myself. So, but anyways, the point of bringing that up is that I appreciate that kind of feedback in terms of what the course will look like next year, and that's one of the questions in my mind is, do we have more assignments spaced out through the whole semester, or do we have these term essays? Keep the focus on that. That's generally my preference, but interested to hear feedback there. Anyways, that's the exam. That's the take-home exam. You've got a week to do it, plenty of time. Are there any questions on that particular assignment? It should be relatively straightforward. I think nothing there should be surprising. I don't try to pull any gotcha moves, surprising moves when it comes to exams. I want my students to succeed. I find it distressing when students don't do well on exams, when it seems like these should be obvious things that we've talked about at length. But there you have it. Okay, any questions, please ask. 1 week to get back to that. Yeah.
I'm
Sure.
not sure, and I know that, like in other classes, we do sort of small reviews, and I'm not sure, and I think I asked this before, do we have any time to do any kind of review through, like in class, or are we just going over the last of your presentation?
Yeah, we're going to go through the extent of the course materials. We'll cover everything that's on the reading list. We had that one lost class along the way there. Normally the last class, in all honesty, the last class would normally be what we just did plus a review that would get you ready to write the identification section. So moving through all of those kind of acronyms and sort of little key ideas that we can sum up in a word or a phrase. And because we don't have the exam, there's no need for you to prepare on that front. And I'm expecting that you would have other priorities at this point. Yeah.
I guess the reason why I say that I'll probably ask you for an office time,
Sure.
because I just like to review
Mm-hmm.
And just to refresh, you know, like looking at the authors, and just a quick look through. I would probably ask for like a private, like an hour of all this stuff.
Sure, sure. Yeah, yeah. We can go over the course as a whole. You know, the focus has been consistent throughout. What are the causes of conflict, and what are the avenues to peace? That's what the course has been about. And I think today I'd like to talk about international terrorism, reflect a bit upon that 2002 national security strategy and how it rejigs American foreign policy to address that threat, what Cohen calls the threat of informal violence or violence from non-state actors. So in a way, I think the topic kind of puts a point on that, the discussions we've been having all the way along. I would say too that, you know, when we're talking about international terrorism, I'm somewhat leery of giving it more credence than it may deserve. There are many threats facing historical humanity presently, and you can give too much oxygen to these aggrieved actors, whether they're Islamic fundamentalists or whether they're far-right terrorist groups. It seems increasingly apparent that the pressing threats facing North America and Europe presently may have more to do with the far right than with the Islamic fundamentalism. So there are questions of where our attention should be focused and how much weight do we give these various actors, or whether we should indeed be, you know, talking about them all in the context of war, or whether, as we discussed last week, this would be more appropriately addressed as a matter of criminality than as a matter of statecraft and of war. So I'm conscious of those hazards. But I think it is obviously important to talk about international terrorism in terms of the prospects of peace. And I would just introduce this first as a set of new challenges to the sovereignty of states. Picking up on Robert Cohen's argument and Hertz's argument about the demise of the territorial state, you know, Hertz, you know, in the aftermath of the Second World War and with the advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear-armed ICBMs, Hertz surmised that we could no longer treat states as hard-shelled units, that this idea of a state is, you know, being fundamentally defined by its capacity to defend its territorial borders, that was in some ways irrelevant given these missiles that easily transcended territorial borders. So the threats came from not necessarily contiguous states, neighboring states, but a state on the far side of the planet could do great damage to us here in North America. The idea of Fortress America no longer had the same substance as it may have prior to the advent of these technologies. Cohen makes the observation that something similar is happening now, but the threats are coming not from other states so much as from non-state actors. And this new kind of conflict that we're witnessing is not easily divided up in terms of the divisions between territorial states. Yeah. These threats are much more amorphous. They don't respect territorial boundaries. And, you know, international terrorism is an obvious example of this, but we could add quite clearly global pandemics and global climate change to that mix of existential threats that are facing states presently, all of which cross over international borders, and at the same time, all of which seem to require concerted action by states. So states cannot confront any of these issues, international terrorism, climate change, global pandemics. They can't address these issues on their own. They can't hold them off at the borders. We've seen that just recently in terms of the new Omicron variant of COVID-19. You know, what was the first political response well, in Ontario and in Canada? What were the politicians clamoring for? What was the first response to this, to the Omicron variant? What do we do?
Vaccine?
Pardon?
And what are the new vaccines?
We don't know yet whether the vaccines will be effective, perhaps less so, but that remains to be seen. What did Canada do? Close the borders.
Oh,
Yeah?
From, what's coming in from South Africa?
South Africa and several other southern African states, southern African nations. And what I'm no epidemiologist here, but what the epidemiologists are telling us is that politically that may seem like a prudent move, but by the time the WHO identifies this as a variant of concern, the horse is out of the stable. It's too late. We know it's here in Canada and probably has been for some time. But that is a very attractive and easy measure for heads of state to take as a demonstration of their sovereignty and as an indication that they're willing to protect their own citizens, seal off the state, even if it doesn't really do anything. And we hear a kind of chorus cry now coming out of South Africa saying, look, we were trying to be good partners in all of this, and we were quite willing and forthcoming about sharing information about this new variant. And this sort of action taken, shutting down the borders, risks closing off those avenues of communication. What we need now is more openness, more communication between states in order to address this threat.
But isn't it, South Africa here are like rational. Nobody seems like, yeah, it just makes sense. They're not doing this because, it's mostly in our country, so at the very least slow down some growth.
It's not clear that it will, though. Again, if it's already here, it's already here. So it's more of a gesture than anything else, and it's a gesture that may compromise relations, so that the cooperation, which is the real means by which we can confront these shared existential threats, whether it's, again, pandemics or climate change or international terrorism, none of these things respect borders. The borders are increasingly meaningless in the face of these amorphous global threats. And so this is one way in which the territorial state is compromised here. Again, it's not a big surprise that politicians, that the Premier of Ontario would say our federal leadership needs to be stronger and close off the borders. That's an old sort of play between provincial and federal governments here, so that you can shift blame onto the next level of government in large part.
That's exactly it.
So there's that aspect of it, just
I
plain
put that in my paper.
playing politics with this. There is that, and then there's the party politics dimension to it as well. Conservative government versus liberal government, portraying the other as somehow partisanship.
Divide, right?
It's a partisan divide. Yeah.
I think I took that out of my paper.
Okay.
But I was talking about that. It was interesting. It was just like, there were so many things that you could
Yeah.
use for an example that in terms of how the existential threat of labor how policies are enforced, at the state, how it is, I guess, very important and on the global scale, like for cooperation, willingness to participate in what I was saying was for those multilateral agreements, like how are we looking at terrorism when there's a threat, that's a threat.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there is talk of some sort of multilateral treaty arrangement that would better prepare nations to confront future global pandemics. And it would probably be easier to negotiate that, short of entering into another actual global pandemic, making those preparations in advance, realizing that our fates are intertwined, realizing that what happens on the far side of the planet affects our daily lives, that these threats cannot be easily contained within these territorial rubrics. And what's clear here too is that the existential threats that are facing states presently are not so much coming from other states. They're coming from non-state actors, or indeed from these not even living actors in the case of viruses, or even from the environment itself. These are not the kinds of security threats that states are used to used to addressing. I think this is part of the reason why the United States chose its response to the September 11th attacks in the ways that it did. It targeted another state. To a person with a hammer, the whole world is a nail waiting to be hit. If you have a military that's tuned to attacking other states, that's what you'll tend to do with it. The militaries are comparatively blunt instruments when it comes to targeting criminal organizations, networked organizations. So they took on the Taliban in so many ways instead of Al Qaeda there. So states are compromised. Territorial states are compromised in their sovereignty by these new threats. And at the same time, terrorist groups have clearly taken advantage of technological developments so as to undercut the state's monopoly on the use of organized violence. And in such a way that the cost of offensive action is much lower than the costs of continual defense. A terrorist group only needs to be able to pull off one successful act. States need to be able to defend themselves continuously over time. So this asymmetry, and Cohen calls attention to this very good piece by Robert Cohen there, kind of a synthetic piece in terms of drawing the literature on international terrorism together. Cohen makes the argument that this asymmetrical conflict between states and non-state actors may give certain advantages to the smaller party, to the non-state actors, for the reason I just described. All of these threats seem to require a degree of cooperation between states precisely because they transcend territoriality. In terms of the threat, I would suggest to you, and this is kind of my thesis here, the real threat that's posed, the existential threat that's posed by terrorism. And do you understand what I mean by existential threat here? I'm not talking about like French continental existentialism, beret-wearing philosophers or things like this. I'm talking about threats that compromise our very existence. They may tear at the fabric of our society, of who we are as a people. And I would say that these threats have as much to do with the actual threats posed to human security, security measured in terms of human lives, as to how the threats are internalized via the recalibration of our security systems and society. Yeah?
Restate your thesis again.
My thesis is that the threat that we're facing here has as much to do with our responses to terrorism as the dangers posed by terrorism. We can say 3,000 people died, 3,000 some people died in the September 11th attack on the World Trade Center, but the consequences to American society, to American politics, and indeed politics the world over, were much more systemic. The danger here consists in what we do in response to terrorism, as much as the damage done in terms of human lives in these attacks themselves. The real impacts of the threats consists of what we make of ourselves in response to them, how we internalize that threat, how we change ourselves, our outlook on the world, how we do things in response to that threat. That's where the danger lies here.
That's where the danger lies.
Yeah.
Okay, so looking at using the same example of the September 11th, you said how we internalize the threat, like how we respond to the threat, as opposed to looking at an event like what's the other option?
The other option is you could say, well, the threat is the 3,000 people that were killed or the people that could be killed in the future. And that's very real. I don't want to discount that. But the impact goes far beyond those lives lost. That's all I'm saying here. And so we should be aware and cautious, prudent about what we do in response to terrorism. Now, it's the difficulty here, of course, politically, is that you could say as Barack Obama actually said after the September 11th attacks that we can take this. 3,000 lives lost is a horrible tragedy, but it doesn't undo the very fabric of our society. Life will carry on. Stock markets were affected in the short term, but bounced back following from that. You could say that really wasn't an existential threat as such until we made it one, until we fundamentally rejigged, American security strategy, for example, following that event. That's where the danger consists. So the document that really sort of wraps up the changes that were made was the 2002 National Security Strategy. That's how the United States responded. And this involved a fundamental rethinking of how the United States would confront the security threats that were facing it. Setting aside the Cold War doctrines of containment and deterrence and adopting preemptive defense as a centerpiece of American foreign policy, along with other things like preventative detentions, without charges laid, including things like the incarceration of combatants at Guantanamo or at CIA black sites, including the extraordinary rendition of terrorist subjects abroad and the use of torture by the United States and its allies. I mentioned the case of Mayor Arar, where Canadian security and intelligence operatives were complicit in the torture of a Canadian citizen to gain information about some potential future attack. That's how terrorism represents an existential threat in how we respond to it. So it is these responses to terrorism, considering how terrorist violence is internalized into the institutional and legal fabric of states, and how the international state system is altered in confronting the threat, that the greatest enduring dangers lie. And those last long after the event itself. So we've seen the consequences of this over the last, what is now 20 years. The normalization of the security state and the surveillance state, for example. There was a debate about normalizing torture within liberal democratic regimes that arguably compromise our very being in terms of being liberal democratic states where the ultimate bearer of value is the individual. If the individual, whether a citizen or otherwise, can be subjected to torture by the state, that calls into question that ethical obligation and the basis of the legitimacy of the state. If the state can do that to any one of us, if we're suspected of being complicit in terrorism or being terrorists ourselves, in so many ways, it seems to me that all bets are off at that point. The social contract itself seems compromised by that change in outlook. The fact that even in polite company you could have that debate, that should we torture our own or should we torture combatants that we capture on the battlefield to gather information from them. The very fact that you could have cocktail party discussions along those lines indicates how we have changed as a society in response to this. That's where the danger lies, in my view. That's the argument that I'd make. And these dangers are expressed in that document that we covered last week, this 2002 National Security Strategy of the United States. And what that document spells out is, as we've discussed, that the fall of the USSR represented an end of the great struggles of the 20th century with a decisive victory for the forces of freedom. There's an implicit argument there that U.S. foreign policymakers were kind of asleep at the switch through the Clinton era and gave up their advantage, their moment of opportunity, their unipolar moment there. And further to that commitments to international institutions, to international law, and to treaties, to the United Nations, to the Kyoto and Paris treaties, to the International Criminal Court through the Rome Statute, that those multilateral commitments somehow inhibited the American capacity to act. Yeah.
So
It's an interesting question. I would expect so. I think the decisions really do matter. And the decision to be taken at that particular juncture was, do we address this as a matter of war, a war on terror, or do we address it as a matter of criminality and try to detain these individuals responsible and try them at the ICC? That could have been one decision taken. Do we capitalize on this sense of solidarity between the rest of the world and the United States? Suddenly the United States looks more, how would you say, more fragile than it may have in the past, yeah? Less like Fortress America, and then there was a sentiment of a fellow feeling that came out of that. The United States could have capitalized on that moment and taken that route in such a way that international institutions and international law would have been buttressed by the most powerful state in human history. Instead, the United States took a go-it-alone approach. They claimed their right to take unilateral action, even if it was taken in breach of international law and against the express will of the UN Security Council, for example. So I think there are very real decisions to be taken. I think that elections matter, and we could have an argument, a discussion about the crowding towards the center between the Republicans and the Democrats, but it seems as if you can see light between them there, especially. Again, to the extent that that Republican government backed away from commitments to international institutions like the ICC, like the Kyoto and Paris treaties that had been entered into by previous democratic governments in the United States. So yeah, I think that mattered very much. Things could have worked out differently. There's nothing faded about any of this. Decisions matter. You know? That would be my assessment, at least. Others, like Chomsky, may argue that the whole American project is an imperial project. I'm familiar with those arguments. I think we all are, but I think there were decisions taken with very real consequences. And so the path to progress that's chosen here is the path of unilateral action, coupled with historical resolve. Acknowledging that this is so new that we really don't know what to do. So what do? We just act with resolve, with a sense of the righteousness of our position and hope that history will judge us kindly. Addressing these new threats to world peace of terrorism, international terrorism, and failed states. So just a quote, a brief passage from the document, writes, quote, "History will judge harshly those who saw this coming danger, this union of radicalism and technology, but failed to act. In the new world we have entered, the only path to peace and security is the path of action." They're going to do something. Specifically, they're going to depose states, Afghanistan and then Iraq. As we defend the peace, we will also take advantage of an historic opportunity to preserve the peace. There was a very real sense in the minds of these American foreign policymakers that they were existing at this sort of turning point in history where they could change the rules of the game. And that's what they were setting out to do by breaking the rules. 9/11 showed that the sovereignty of nation states was compromised by globalization and its conduit technology, and hence an international rules-based order created on the foundation of the nation state, for example, the United Nations and other international institutions and treaties, was seen to be on shaky ground somehow. And so the 2002 National Security Strategy talks about the international community largely in terms of relations between great powers, where what is real and efficacious, according to this view, is the sovereign power of states to unilaterally preempt potential future threats, whether originating from non-state actors or the state sponsors of terror. And this is what we know as the Bush Doctrine. The Bush Doctrine. The Bush Doctrine, which again makes preemptive defenses against potential future threats the core of American foreign policy, coupled with removing tyrants who might aid and abet international terrorist groups, removing tyrants from powers so that they cannot do so. This comes back to a question that we asked earlier. Is the doctrine of preemption justified in combating international terrorism? This is the argument that was made at the time, that the rules of the game have changed given this new threat, international terrorism, and given the apprehension that these groups may acquire weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, or perhaps biological, and that they would be willing to use them. And so given that threat assessment, this old idea of the limits of preemptive defense no longer held water. I'll just remind you of what we mean by preemptive defense. Recall the Carolyn Doctrine. Under international law norms, a preemptive defense is justified only given, quote, a necessity of self-defense, instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. Self-defense must be necessary. You have to do it. You have no other choice. You can't wait until later. You can't take other means. And you don't have time to decide, so this is what we need to do in the moment. You know, if a missile is on its way before it is landing, you are justified in trying to preempt that attack, but not before. A missile pointed in your direction is not a justification of preemptive attack. So this change, I think, was one of the major impacts. This change in American foreign policy was one of the most significant impacts of those September 11th attacks, which forces us to ask, does that principle still hold under conditions of globalization? Can we afford to keep our fealty to that principle that defense is only justified if it is based on the necessity of self-defense, instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation? What do we make of that? Have the rules of the game changed fundamentally here? Does terrorism sort of clear the deck of those old norms and the international law and institutions that they sustained? What do we think? Jared, you had your hand up earlier there a moment?
I want to say no, because it's resistance.
I'm sorry, it's what?
It's resistance. If America will go across the war in Iraq for a terrorist threat, yet for COVID, which is an even more bigger threat, it just sits and watches the world go to the experience.
Hmm.
This is pretty unique in the war.
Now we're dealing with different administrations there too, and you know the Trump administration was decidedly more isolationist than the presidency of George W. Bush, two presidents before, two administrations before. So there was a real sea change in terms of American foreign policy. I think partly given and there's some merit to this, given the disastrous impacts of the war in Iraq. Yeah.
I was gonna say the war in Iraq.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, how do you have preemptive and always assuming that there is a threat and then going into a country and, going to look to see if they do and then, going to occupy certain parts of the country, like the war in Iraq, and then they don't have the missiles.
A nuclear program.
Wasn't even there,
No.
but they still went ahead anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So it shocks us, I guess, there's never any question of where do we draw the line with these preemptive, like where is it that we're just, where is it?
Yeah, and of course the fundamental purpose of the United Nations and the UN Security Council and the UN Charter is to prevent wars of aggression. That is the crime that contains all other crimes within it. And this is the real danger here, is that it becomes difficult to distinguish between the United States acting in its own defense or other powerful states doing the same and wars of aggression. And if we can't delineate those two, this is fundamentally destabilizing for international order. Again, that's the damage done by international terrorism there as these norms shift in terms of the relations between states and what states feel justified in doing for their own self-defense.
It was destabilizing for the states.
For the international order as a whole. It's clearly destabilizing for Iraq and Afghanistan, for neighboring states, for the Middle East, but it extended beyond that. What we're witnessing presently in eastern Ukraine, where Canadian soldiers are in harm's way in Latvia to defend Eastern European states against the potential threat of a Russian invasion, I would say that's a knock-on consequence of what happened here as well. The Russian Federation felt emboldened to say, okay, if the rules have changed, you can do that in Iraq, we'll do that in Ukraine and perhaps in the Baltic states too. Yeah. Exactly. So we wouldn't normally associate Russian interference in eastern Ukraine or the annexation of Crimea in 2014 with the invasion of Iraq, but I think you can draw a really clear line connecting those events. When powerful states break the rules, when the powerful states aren't backers of a rules-based international order, other powerful states feel at liberty to do the same in their neighborhoods. And that's part of what we're seeing. Part of the bellicosity of China could be taken as a reflection of the sea change that occurred in the early 2000s as well. But there is a kind of parity here. There is a sharing of interests amongst great powers, whether it's China or Russia or the United States. All of them have this apprehension about the threats posed by these non-state actors, by informal violence, by international terrorism. And in so many ways, this war on terror became a rubric shared in more broadly by other states. When Belarus is cracking down on dissidents, it can claim that these are terroristic actions that it's holding in abeyance. That sort of door is opened here too. I just make some brief comments, and this should be pretty familiar. Brief comments on the war on terror as such that came out of this security strategy. I would say that one danger here is that we give recognition to a criminal entity that it does not deserve. Al-Qaeda did not deserve to be recognized as the sort of formidable antagonist to the United States. When you take someone on in a fight, when you say, we're going to war now, there's hostility, obviously, but there's a moment of recognition that's included there too, where you take that other on as a worthy antagonist, rather than as a mere criminal, which would have been an alternative take here. And this idea that Al-Qaeda was now at war with the superpower, Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, gave them a kind of street cred that they may not have had otherwise, that certainly fueled their efforts to to generate followers for their causes. So the war on terror is not, properly speaking, a matter of war in that it gives a sort of recognition to criminal enemies. Acting as a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, stoking the sorts of wars that add to the recruitment efforts of terrorist organizations. And again, this claimed right to unilateral action weakens international institutions like the Security Council, like the International Atomic Energy Agency. And in the absence of a set of rules governing global politics, one is left with the law of the jungle, pure power politics, in which power is judged only by its efficacy. Okay, so this is, I would say, the damage done. That shift in American foreign policy, and we could extend that to changes in terms of our domestic politics as well, but in terms of international relations, this was the real consequence of the September 11th attacks. let's get to the topic of terrorism itself. Backing away from this, the American responses to it. Just as a working kind of definition here, and this is a contested term as most political terms are, I'd say terrorism is the use of violence against civilian populations in order to inspire terror, in order to weaken the fabric of a society, in order to break down the social contract itself, in part, through the sense of uncertainty that's created by the attacks themselves. This came out of nowhere. Who are these people? The attack was, in the homeland, not at the sort of peripheries of an American empire. So that was unsettling. But the terrorist attacks were unsettling also in terms of the responses that were engendered. The politics of the worst is what terrorists are striving to accomplish here, with the intent of eliciting these overreactions. So as to say, look, this is the state that we're dealing with. Look, the United States is an empire. And we've proved this because of the invasion of Afghanistan and then Iraq. Or look, the state is this is the tyranny. And we proved this when we pushed the state to engage in mass incarcerations of young Arab Muslim men in New York. Or when we pushed the state to engage in torture of combatants. So terrorism has that intent of unsettling our expectations as to what the state is for. Yeah? Terrorism is use of violence against civilian populations to inspire terror in order to weaken the fabric of the society, in order to kind of undo our common sense in a way. And so the fabric of society, our social contract, what we expect of the state, and this was belied by the explicit response, which was that we live in a new world now, and so the old rules no longer apply. Yep.
What's the terrorist endgame, considering that their strategy to look at an overreaction will come to the expense of their own people?
That's a good question. That's a good question. What is the end game here? And I think it really depends upon, that's a generalized definition that I think would apply to a number of different actors. In terms of the end game, you would have to address the specifics of a particular terrorist group.
So if you go, it seems like it's on the line. If you really want to be positive and friendly with Muslim people, why would you be an American to avoid some killing from Muslim people?
Well, there actually we've got a really handy answer. He issued fatwas. Al-Qaeda was quite public about what their purposes were. The purpose of Al-Qaeda was to remove American forces from the Arabian Peninsula and secure Palestine as an independent state and replace secular dictatorships propped up by the United States with Islamic theocracies. That was their end game. That's what they wanted to accomplish. And by baiting the United States into these wars in Muslim-majority countries, they raised support for their cause, and they gave themselves a kind of perceived legitimacy, as being defenders against American imperialism.
How does that really benefit their endgame? By drawing America into the Middle East further, they're actively making so that the national progress of America might be needed once the peaceful doesn't occur. So all they did was just encourage them to enter the Middle East even more heavily.
Yeah, and you know what? My view on this has changed over time. Initially, I took a view that Lacour was right about Al-Qaeda here too, that this was a kind of postmodern terrorism in the sense that its aspirations were entirely vain, hyperbolic, the sort of wild fantasies of religious fanatics. That was my initial take on this. But, reflecting on what's happened just recently, terrorism seems to have accomplished its goals in Afghanistan, where the Taliban increasingly took on terrorist means, attacking soft targets, using roadside bombs and suicide bombers in order to topple the secular regime in Kabul capital in Kabul and to replace it with an Islamic theocracy. So in that sense, they seem to have accomplished their end game in Afghanistan, at least. And ISIS did something similar for a brief period of time in Syria and in Iraq, with the establishment of a caliphate, an Islamic theocracy there. So it's perhaps less wild and fanatical than we may have first assumed. That said, if you look at Al-Qaeda and its more radical offshoots presently, the goal is not just holding territory in Muslim-majority nations. The goal is to establish a global caliphate. And it's hard here to discern between the sort of the theological dimension of this in terms of bringing about a kind of millenarian world-ending conflict between the devout and the apostates. There is that dimension to this, kind of bringing on the end of the world that would inspire people to kill themselves for this higher cause, this transcendent cause. There is that. But at various turns, you see these much more discrete political objectives open up where you say, the interest here is for ISIS to hold territory in Syria and Iraq, or for the Taliban to hold territory and govern in Afghanistan.
I don't need to too into the religion for it, but how discouraging it has to be for people to leave such a blind faith in a random club that was written by a bunch of Romans thousands of years ago. For a God that doesn't exist.
Well, there's a dismissive attitude towards religion there, which is fine for you, but clearly there are believers. Yeah.
I don't know if it's okay.
Yeah.
What makes the Quran any more special than the Bible?
Well, I am no expert on the Quran, so I can't claim any sort of privileged knowledge there.
The Bible must definitely say Plato was the Bible.
Uh,
Because I argue Plato was probably the far better book.
Sure, and we can have that discussion over tea. But when it comes to entering into a fight with this religious fervor inspiring you, I think Cohen makes a good point here, and that is that we've been too dismissive of other bases of legitimacy in terms of our international relations. We kind of assume that everyone is a rational, self-interested, calculating automaton after Hobbes, and clearly that's not the case. Now you can say that that's crazy to think that what justifies your act of brutal violence against the civilian population is the promise of virgins in the afterlife. That seems just so at odds with our sensibilities. But people do believe that. Yeah?
Sorry, who was the author that said that we have been too dismissive of other forms of legitimacy?
That's Robert Cohen.
Cohen?
Yeah. The Globalization of Informal Violence. Great essay. You've got a link to it there. I'd recommend. It's a great essay because it stretches our conception of why people do the things that they do. And at the very least, as students of political science, we need to be able to understand, whether we agree or not, with why people are acting in the ways they are. Clearly, religion has some influence on global politics presently. Clearly, theocracies represent a very real challenge to liberal democratic regimes. Which quote is that? Yeah, I would say draw on Cohen there. Draw on Cohen's essay in that regard. He makes the point quite clear. I don't have the page numbers in front of me here, but it's in the essay. Anyway, now Lacour, in his essay on postmodern terrorism, places a great deal of emphasis on the vain quality of what he calls postmodern terrorism, the seeming impossibility of their ends, and their largely symbolic and spectacular character. So, for example, and to update his argument, I think remarkably sage argument made in the mid-1990s, 96 I think is when he wrote this piece in Foreign Affairs. But if we consider the 9/11 attacks, in some ways they had used elements of what Lacour calls traditional terrorism, the hijacking of airplanes. But what was unique part of what was unique about those hijackings is that the 9/11 suicide bombers made no demands. In the past, when planes have been hijacked, the PLO was this was one of the tactics that they used at various turns before they were recognized as a legitimate political authority. They would hijack a plane. They would generally ask for the release of political prisoners and for the plane to land in a safe country like Libya, for example, so they could disembark and be on their way. It was shocking that these attackers, these terrorists, made no demands, had no communication, and just straight away crashed the planes into a building. You've got to ask, well, what was that for? What are they trying to accomplish? What are the political interests at play here beyond that religious fervor and just a vehement hatred for the United States? I think we can say that quite clearly. That's part of what's behind it, is a deep-seated hatred of the United States and this millenarian religious sensibility. Now, those actions have been linked to the al-Qaeda network and to its spiritual leader, Osama bin Laden. And as I mentioned, the stated aims of al-Qaeda are the removal of American armed forces from Arab states, securing Palestine as a sovereign state, and the establishment of Islamic theocracies. But considering the structure and character of networked associations, and we didn't talk a lot about that. That would be one of the topics I would take up if we had more time, the role of networks as opposed to states. Even those purposes, though, must be considered somewhat loosely. The terrorists themselves were joined together by their reaction against what they perceived as the system, with their hatred focused on the American empire and its state conduits, especially in the Middle East. And if they cannot effectively change that system, they lash out against it. This, according to Lacour, indicates the futility of these new forms of terrorism and indicate that there's something new going on here, something that he calls postmodernism. So what is it about this that's postmodern? Postmodernism in general terms refers to a repudiation of the grand narratives of modernity. It's saying no to the idea of progress itself. And I think we're familiar with that idea of progress from our other course, especially the course on cosmopolitanism. This idea that progress is measured in terms of how the extent to which we recognize and realize human beings as fundamentally free and equal, with that recognition afforded by the rule of law within states, advancing towards a global recognition of universal human rights, with technology taken as a vehicle for human liberation. That's the grand narrative of modernity. That's the story we tell about ourselves. That's our secular faith, if you will. That's what gives us a sense of common purpose the world over and promises some freer and more fair cosmopolitan future. This is what postmodernism, this is what the terrorists reject, that vision of human purpose, for a variety of reasons. Without getting into theology here, the rejection is this idea that human beings are fundamentally free and equal. If you say that the purpose of human life is to love and serve God, that's a very different response to the liberal response, which is that the purpose of human life is to become more free and equal in this world. I'd say terrorism is part of the spectacle of politics as entertainment after the end of history, when that grand narrative of progress loses its impetus and influence. Both Lacour and Cohen call attention to this, that there's some sense in which that idea of progress had already been waning. The extent to which people were actively taken up with that purpose to say that, yeah, this is what our lives are for, this is what we're collectively striving towards, that seemed to be falling apart at that point. You could see liberalism, for example, kind of degrading into relativism, to each their own, degrading into consumerist materialism, where the good is what can you consume. And that seems less effective at gathering people together for a common purpose. We each go after our respective corners and carry on with whatever measure of fulfillment that may happen to be. Yeah? And like the war on terror that goes with it, terrorism is also politics as entertainment, a kind of collective tragedy played out on the global stage. And it's distinguished from what he calls traditional terrorism, which had discrete political or ideological ends. The point is not the spectacle. The point is not the planes crashing into the tower in such a way that everyone's attention is rapidly focused on that particular moment. In traditional terrorism, you can say that there are ideological or political interests informing the terrorist violence undertaken. It is a means to an end, a desperate measure by disempowered groups. So if we're to look at traditional forms of terrorism, you can think here in terms of groups like the IRA, Irish Republican Army, ETA in Spain, the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. There we're dealing with groups that have subnational claims to autonomy, denied within the structure of the state within which they find themselves. It's a desperate measure to get a seat at the table and to claim a state for themselves. To claim a Tamil state in northern Sri Lanka for the Tamil people, and part of the Tamil Tigers, for example. Not just as a point of interest, the first group to use suicide bombings in the modern era in a systematic fashion. The Tamil Tigers, Tamil, Tamil. Just as a point of interest, is everyone familiar with the pop singer MIA? Tamil, pardon? Okay, yeah, what is that? The bird song. She had a few hits. Anyway, she's associated. She's Tamil, and there have been questions about her association with that particular group. Pardon? Tamil? It's a Tamil name. And the Sri Lankans would say that they belong in India. The Tamils would say, no, we belong right here in northern Sri Lanka, and we will fight for an independent state for ourselves. It's in northern Sri Lanka, and brutally suppressed in 2009 in Sri Lanka's civil war, and removed from any influence at that particular juncture. But it's in a kind of means to an end by a disempowered group to attain political autonomy. That's how terrorism has functioned in the past. Postmodern terrorism doesn't have those sort of clear political interests or ideological ends. So he points to an example current at the time, Aum Shinrikyo, AUMSHINRIKYO, Aum Shinrikyo. Japanese doomsday cult, religiously inspired, trying to bring about the end of the world, and responsible for it was 1995 Tokyo subway nerve gas attacks that killed several and injured many more. They also experimented with anthrax attacks, but just indiscriminate violence that you couldn't associate with any clear political end. Like, what was that for? How do we make sense of this sort of religiously inspired violence? And this is one of the key differentiations that Lacour marks, is the influence of religious fanaticism on these new forms of terrorism. Again, where we kind of de-link from these traditional political ends. And I think we could add to that these religiously inspired groups like Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, its franchises, ISIS, Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia. Al-Shabaab, it's been in the news recently. They've kind of been pushed out of Somalia, and Ugandan forces are targeting them elsewhere. But Al-Shabaab is the group that claimed responsibility rather publicly for the 2013 Nairobi Westgate Mall attack. And it's kind of an interesting bridge between the two in that it's an Al-Qaeda affiliate with then its ultimate spiritual leader being al-Zawahiri, at the time now presumed to be hiding in Pakistan with a $25 million bounty on his head. Al-Zawahiri issued a set of guidelines for Al-Qaeda jihadists. So this is how the franchise was working, that Al-Qaeda would issue these fatwas, these religious edicts, and then all of the groups would kind of fall in line. He issued these guidelines for jihadists prior to a rash of terrorist attacks in Pakistan, in Iraq, and in Kenya. And if we compare the attacks to the guidelines, it appears that these franchises are working in a rather loose association with the base. Al-Qaeda literally meaning the base. So, for example, Al-Shabaab, operating out of a country, Somalia, that Zawahiri identified as a front in this global jihad that he was trying to encourage, appears to fulfill a core organizational aim of occupying territory. They're trying to reestablish the Council of Islamic Courts that was ousted from Somalia, from Mogadishu, by the United States, France, and Kenyan forces, so as to reestablish an Islamic theocracy in that country. So that's kind of traditional terrorism, that they want to have a juridical order in occupied territory, much as ISIS did in Iraq and Syria, and as the Taliban's doing presently in Afghanistan. At the same time, though, all of these particular attacks in Pakistan, in Iraq, and in Kenya do not respect the directives given by Al-Qaeda to limit collateral damage and to avoid attacks at mosques and markets. So why would Al-Qaeda say, don't attack mosques, don't attack the markets? What would be their political interest in issuing that fatwa, that edict? Beyond just human decency, there's that dimension of it, but beyond that, yeah, you want to gain adherence to your cause. And you're less likely to do so if you're seen as a threat to your own people. This is an obvious kind of point, that if you're claiming to represent a disenfranchised minority, it's hard to make that claim if you're killing them. You just look like evildoers at that point. Now, here's how Al-Shabaab justified its occupation of the mall, the Westgate Mall in Kenya. And this was done at the time they live tweeted the attack. This was kind of a remarkable sort of adoption of modern means of technology and communication. That throughout the attack, as they were inside the mall, they were tweeting about what they were doing. So we had this very unusual level of insight into their thinking, and what their motives were. So they say, I'm quoting here, and pardon me for doing so, the Mujahideen entered Westgate Mall today around noon and are still inside the mall fighting the Kenyan Kufar infidels inside their own turf. What Kenyans are witnessing at Westgate, so they're trying to give this traction and turn this into an event. This is politics as entertainment here. They want as many eyeballs on this as they can. This is retributive justice for crimes committed by their own military. So they're referring there to Kenyan incursions into Somalia to oust the Council of Islamic Courts. There's a kind of political motive. You'd say, okay, the Kenyans did something to the Somalis, and the Somalis are doing something back in retribution, perhaps to deter future interventions in what they see as their own affairs. Yeah.
They already know the answer, but why do you keep doing this for profit? Like, don't we see the own history of every other terrorist organization and how they basically have always failed? They're like, yeah, let's try this again. It don't work, I swear.
There's something desperate about it, certainly, although, reflecting on the success in Afghanistan, I think this may inspire other groups to do more of the same, saying, well, and do they really care? Does the Taliban really care for the well-being of the Afghan people? Do they care if their people are going to starve over this winter, with their national budget cut by 80% and cut off from foreign aid? Or do they just care for holding on to power through whatever means necessary? I would tend to think the latter, considering the means by which they attain power, which was the use of terroristic violence targeting civilian populations. That's how they got into the position they're in now, by targeting their own. So they, in my mind, they clearly don't really care for their own. They care for power, and they're inspired by their religious fervor, quite clearly. But so back to the Westgate Mall attacks and Al-Shabaab, this is an interesting example because it has those aspects of traditional terrorism. They want to reestablish themselves as the authority within Somalia, and they're acting in response to incursions into their territory. At the same time, though, when they were in the mall, they issued no demands whatsoever. So they took hostages, but they didn't say, we'll give these hostages up if X, Y, and Z occur. And through their live Twitter feed, they openly mocked Kenyan attempts to negotiate with them. So there was no negotiating with them once they were inside. Their intent was to kill as many people as possible. That seemed to be the point, to create as much of a spectacle as they could, and basically to reinforce their capacity to do so. What they were demonstrating is that they could cause violence. That was the point of their actions taken. And in such a way that you could dissociate the political ends or interests from what they were doing. So on the one hand, there is a subnational claim to autonomy. On the other, there's an affiliation with transnational aims of establishing a global caliphate. The representative of Al-Shabaab says, the wars will not end until Sharia law is implemented in all of the continents of the world. If that's their ultimate aim, that seems impossible. That seems like wild religious fantasy, but it's clearly a fantasy that inspires them to engage in these acts of abhorrent violence. All right, let's take a little break at this juncture, and then we'll reconvene on the topic, please. Hey, well, it was good having you in here, Jared. It was good having you in. I'll be back to you with your essay, and make sure that you make some arrangements to get your essay back, because I'll put comments on it.
Perfect. That was one of my questions.
Yeah. Keeping in mind that our definitions of terrorism are contested terms, but we're recording here. So here's a definition. This is from Title 22, Chapter 38, Section 2656F. According to U.S. law, quote, the term terrorism means, and we'll go through this in detail, breaking it down. The term terrorism means premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents. Perpetrated against non-combatant targets, civilian targets, I think is the language I used, soft targets, by subnational groups or clandestine agents. Clandestine agents, yeah. So they could be agents of states, is what that means, yeah. Acting via proxy through terrorist organizations. So let's break that down. The term terrorism means premeditated. What? Yeah.
As soon as you said premeditated,
Yeah.
I had an immediate concern.
Okay, why is that?
Because how do you know if something, how do you absolutely know if something's premeditated for sure and not, an act
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is one of the challenges in terms of Ontario provincial law and Canadian federal law. Any definitions of terrorism that include what they call a motive clause are difficult to ascertain because it's hard to know why someone did what they did. It's relatively easy to know what they did. So if you were to murder someone, for example, or if someone were to murder someone, not you, not I, but someone were to murder some other human being, you could say that human being murdered that human being. There's a person who's dead, that person who's responsible and murder occurred. The question of why they did what they did, what their motive was, and here, whether the motive was premeditated, did they, well, you could sort of ascertain that. Can you demonstrate that there was a thought process leading up to that event? But what this implies is a kind of rationality associated with the event. There is a political reason why they did the thing that they did. But there's a sort of in-between territory here. We are implying a rationality to the actor. The law should apply to them because they are a rational actor. They're not crazy. They're not insane. They can be coerced. They have that rationality. They could perhaps be deterred from doing this to the extent that they have a rationality and can understand the consequences of their actions. So the law may have some deterrent effect against them then because they can think into the future. But, reflecting on Israeli politics, for example, an Israeli settler radical who goes on a rampage killing Muslims is reported by the Israeli press often as having a breakdown, having a mental breakdown. The violence looks the same. It looks like there's a political occasion for it. An Israeli settler attacking Muslims in Israel seems political. But in the heat of the moment, were they just deranged? Were they insane? Were they reacting? Was it premeditated or otherwise? So we can use that language of premeditation to describe some acts as terrorist and set apart others as being something else, the acts of the insane. And that said, too, there seems to be something particularly insane about all of these kinds of action. We can talk about the political demands made by Osama bin Laden, but flying jet planes with passengers on them into a building for spectacular effect or otherwise looks pretty insane, to a reasonable human being. This is how U.S. law defines it. Premeditated, politically motivated violence. What's the importance of that particular clause? That the purpose of the violence is political. Why is that significant? This is perhaps the most important dimension of this definition.
Well, if something is politically motivated, then they're trying to make a change or influence how states behave or or even how society behaves or population.
They're trying to change outlooks and attitudes. They're trying to influence the behaviors of states, as you say. What would be could be ideological. We saw that through the 60s with the Red Army and the Baader Meinhof gang, like sort of left-wing terrorist groups. You don't see that much any longer. We see it in the right-wing terrorist actions in the United States, advocating for a white ethno-state in the United States, for example.
Power struggles, like struggles for legitimacy and I guess power and voice, but
Legitimacy, or even just at a level, we can dial that language down just to notoriety. They want to attract attention to their cause. Yeah,
So this definition comes from U.S. law.
that's right.
So wouldn't under this definition then like January 6th be considered a terrorist act?
Interesting. Yeah, there is violence there, politically motivated, premeditated, and that's what we're getting into now with the investigation into the sources of it and how Bannon was involved and how Trump was involved in orchestrating these attacks. I think you could make the case that was, insurrection or terrorism.
It just seems from this definition it's the premeditated, politically motivated.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to check a few of those boxes.
Although it's directed towards the seat of power, towards government, rather than towards civilian or soft targets. If those crowds had gone on a rampage in a public square, perhaps that would be more akin to our understanding, and this might put those events more in the category of an insurgency rather than than terrorist violence because of who is being attacked. Yeah, yeah.
So politically, the violence is to government, right?
Yeah, and to society as a whole. I think you're right to make that connection. Yeah. And so, what wouldn't be included then? What kind of violence would not?
Non-state actors?
No, we're talking about non-state actors here too. Yeah. What kind of violence would not be included in this sort of politically motivated violence then?
So what is non-political?
Yeah, what's non-political violence?
Something that, violence that is not directed towards people.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe like conflicts between different states then, just because non-political violence would be stuff like race issues, other.
That's not violent. You're not.
Yeah, okay.
You're not targeting civilian populations there. You're just engaged in rough trade negotiations. What would be an example of violence targeting civilians that is not political? It happens all the time. You know, terrorism, just crime. The crime, yeah? So, and the ends of criminals are what?
Essentially, like the ends of criminals are just like what it is. Like they're committing a crime and whether it be whatever their interest be. I don't know.
Maybe personal gain.
Yeah.
If they're stealing for themselves or for their crime syndicate. You know, it might be the mob.
Okay, that makes sense.
Personal gain. There's something in it for them. Yeah.
Otherwise,
But
why would anybody do it?
exactly. They may harm or try to kill someone because they hate that person or for whatever personal relation they may have there. Again, they may steal for their own benefit.
Hate crimes and those kinds of crimes, like they're all, there's different types of crimes.
Yeah. What distinguishes terrorism is that there's a political agenda.
Okay.
Yeah, there's some greater cause. And, you know, conspicuously, if we're dealing especially with suicide bombers, you would say there's nothing in it for them. You could talk about the afterlife, that's a whole other set of questions, but they're doing it for some political purpose.
Yeah, and I would say, like the terrorist attacks, although there was no communication, there was definitely a reason why they did it. Like there was, you wouldn't be able to say that there's no possibility, they were just crazy. There's no possibility, we know that they hit two major, World Trade Towers. We know that and it's on the United States, the Great Tower, and then they would, like, even if they didn't want any negotiation, you know that they were making statements themselves.
Yeah. And the statement could be as simple as, we can do this, we have the capacity to do this, you're not invulnerable, that this is blowback for American imperialism. That's in the minds of the architects of 9/11. These are the reasons why. You've supported secular dictators in the Middle East. This is not, these governments do not reflect the will of the people. No? Their secularism is evidence of that it's not of those particular people we want Islamic theocracies. And, you know, then we can start speculating on the sort of political end game here. Is the aim to draw the United States into a war in a Muslim majority nation to show them up to be what they are claiming they are, which is imperialists. So as to gain legitimacy for their cause as their resistance to that imperialism. So there we have a kind of a set of political interests and motives that are at play there that would distinguish us from mere criminality. Although they blend in here at a point too. You know,
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, I think you could have them both. Like you could have, terrorism, their crime committed, while
yeah, the overlap here. One sort of notorious instance of overlap between crime and terrorism is the trade in illicit drugs, for example. So the trade in opium coming out of Afghanistan helped to sustain the Taliban and Al Qaeda, and with the advantage there too of kind of poisoning the West, to kind of poison the body politic by exporting these drugs to the enemy. You know, there's a kind of a political dimension to that, and they make the money that's required to sustain the movement over time. We see similar things in terms of narco-terrorists in South and Central America. Interestingly, just today, the United States removed the FARC, a left-wing narco-terrorist group that had been seeking the overthrow of the Colombian government, removed them from their list of terrorist organizations. Because about 5 years ago, I think it was now, FARC and the Colombian government signed a peace agreement, and FARC now has transformed itself from an armed insurgency responsible for the terrorizing of peasant populations, to sustain its narco trafficking, dabbling in kidnapping and ransoming associated with that. They've shifted their operations from criminal activities. They are now a recognized political party in Colombian politics. That was part of the peace deal. And it was difficult for many Colombians on the right to take it, and it's a left-wing, ideologically left-wing group as well. Difficult to take, to say, how do we sit down at the table? How do we include these people in our government when we know that they were narco traffickers who kidnapped people for ransom?
That's how they got legitimacy, like through having power. They're like, well, we want our seat at the table, and they got it.
They did. Interestingly, the Colombian peace deal stipulated that that women had to be involved in the negotiation of it as well, and there is arguably, in terms of the analysis of this, less of a sense of these sort of, how would you say, grinding animosities, more of a willingness to say, let bygones be bygones, so that we can move our way out of this ongoing civil war, and shift the conflict from outright antagonism, armed conflict, to agonism, to use most language there, and just as a sidebar. But there's another example of a terrorist group that actually succeeded in their ends.
What was their name again?
The FARC, F-A-R-C. And I don't know Spanish, so I can't fill you in as to the background there, but this was the principal armed insurgency that operated in Colombia for decades now, and that has now become politicized. So terrorists seek to destabilize states, whereas criminal organizations, like corporations, are more concerned with making money and may value a measure of state stability, especially if you can have compliant, corrupt governments that would facilitate your business. Let's say, back to the definition then. So we have premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets. So the aim here is not to target the state as such. And again, this might be why that insurrection at the Capitol could be set apart as terrorism properly so called, because it did target the state, but to target rather soft targets, civilian targets. What would be the interest there? Why would terrorist groups not target military installations, but rather civilians? Yep.
If they target, there's a couple of things that are interesting. So, one of the, okay, so what about when they're targeting soft targets, but they're civilians, and what about if they're, like, if they're supposed to be on the opposition, right, but it's still the opponent, so they're just, like, say, the United States, it wasn't the president who got targeted, it was the military, like the civilians.
Although the Pentagon was targeted as well, and the White House was likely targeted too, along with the World Trade Center. So you had the center military, and these are symbolic targets. Yeah? A military target, government in the case of the White House, and finance in the case of the WTO. Centers of American power, symbolic centers of American power there.
Because military leaders are more important to that kind of stuff, so if people were wanting to spread terror and incite uncertainty, you want to target the weaker
Mhm.
Whereas when you attack someone whose daily life normally does not involve that type of stuff, they become more fearful. Yeah.
The point is to terrorize the population. And as you say,
people that are, the word subservient, they're accountable to the population, so.
the military is, and
They're
yeah.
required to provide security and protection to the population. So if you're targeting your population and you're putting, the whole reason why you're in the government is you're destabilizing that government and that legitimacy in your thing. So then your population can turn against the government itself.
Yeah, you show the state out to be dysfunctional. There's a very practical dimension of it. Now, let's not sort of kid ourselves here that it's difficult to target military installations, though they may have high symbolic value, and it's much easier to target civilians. And it's impossible to defend sports stadiums or downtown squares or crowded streets or Thanksgiving Day parades or things like this, although that wasn't an act of terrorism, that recent attack. But it's more practical. But as you say, it kind of breaks down the social contract. It shows the state to be incapable of performing its most basic function. This is the politics of the worst. To kind of create this sense of nihilism and create a sense of the dysfunction of the state in order to tear it down. Terrorism, pardon? Something like that. You're on point with this, though. Yeah, that terrorists.
Why they target civilians?
They, in terms of the effect, in terms of the spectacle of it, it damages the trust that we have in one another and the trust that we have in our state to defend us. So we start looking sideways at any stranger on the street or a suspicious-looking person on the plane. It breaks down our civil society at that level, and then it breaks down our sense of trust in the state to defend us. And that's what terrorists are trying to call into question, the institutions of representative democracy themselves and the capacities of state sovereignty. There's a
If they were to target the main actors, then they're just removing an actor itself. I mean, it wouldn't harm the state per se because somebody was just displacing them.
Well, there's part of that, although, like late 19th century terrorism, early 20th century terrorism, the targeting of heads of state was a fixture there. The origins of the World War I in the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. This is an example of that kind of activity. We don't see that as much presently. We see this these attacks on like the World Trade Center, for example, or the Westgate Mall in Kenya. Yeah.
Sorry, what did you say the first Archduke of the World War assassination of who?
Archduke Franz Ferdinand by the Serbian group, the Black Hand. Yeah.
And what did you say was the consequence? Like, say, if they were to, like back then, that's what they did, was they assassinated heads of state. What was the consequence of that? Like, why did it end? Why now? I mean,
Why?
Was it effective at that time?
Interesting. Well, it caused World War I, so there's that obvious sort of effect. We see, though, you put me on the spot now. I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about the sort of right-wing terrorist attack on Rideau Hall recently in terms of Canadian history. Was that 20? Was it that far back now?
It's been a while. I remember that vividly because that was one of the first times in recent memory that an attack like that was.
There was the attack at the War Memorial in Ottawa.
Yeah, that might be one.
That was I think the first. The attack on Rideau Hall was more recently than 2015. I think it was just the last.
There was some. I remember there was a video.
Is that the Manitoba men who ran the gate at Rideau Hall?
Yeah, that's right.
There's a video of an MP or something working there with their gun.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the sergeant at arms who shot the individual there in that particular instance. I remember we were having a class and we were watching the news come out as we were having the honors seminar, and that would have been back around then, around 2015. Now we're talking two separate events here, though, too. 2021.
One for
the Rideau Hall
Yeah,
attempt.
and what was
Was
2015?
2021? Oh, that, okay.
It couldn't have been 2015 because it was during Trudeau's
Yeah, no, I'm definitely
administration.
the previous.
The, the attack on the War Memorial in Ottawa, and I think it was Captain Cirillo was the ceremonial guard there who was killed. Now that individual responsible, for my knowledge, of that particular event, it looked like a terrorist attack. He went immediately to the Parliament buildings and started making his way through with a rifle.
So he was going through the Parliament buildings, and there were videos of MPs in the hall.
Mm-hmm.
Some had taken up their own arms and.
Mm-hmm. And huddling away. It was Harper at the time. Harper would have been Prime Minister at the time.
On camera, which was one of the first. It was spectacle almost because it was one of the first attacks in recent memory where you have these clear videos of this
Mm-hmm.
happening.
And on Twitter, just live tweets of in terms of where the individual is moving around through the city. What was unclear there, and it's hard to discern at points, again, because there's a motive clause, what his aim was. He had some sort of rambling accounts that could have been linked to Al-Qaeda, but he was clearly mentally unwell at the same time and had addiction issues, had been living in the rough, so had been homeless for a while. It was a real, very troubled individual in that particular instance. It became difficult to say that there was any political motive to that action whatsoever there. Although Al-Qaeda and ISIS have been effective at recruiting from troubled young men and sort of fostering their addictions by actually feeding them drugs. We had an individual from Timmins who made his way to Raqqa, to Syria, to join in that cause, radicalized online. You just imagine, what would it take to shape the thinking of an individual to make your way from Timmins to Syria to enter into a civil war? Obviously, that individual is not coming from a good place to begin with. But if you can associate all of those personal grievances with some greater cause, and say that you can now contribute to this greater good, I can identify the evils that you see all around you and tell you how you can target those, how you can make your life worth living in relation to this greater good. That's where the political motive comes into play, regardless of the individual's sort of own personal history. And then finally, in terms of this definition, just to wrap this up, the actions are taken by sub-national groups or clandestine agents. And this is really contested territory because here we admit that we may be dealing with sub-national actors or lone wolves. Lacour calls attention to lone wolf attacks as being sort of emblematic of the future of terrorism, where you have these loose affiliations, maybe based on religion, maybe just based on deep hatred and antipathy towards this regime or that. But you have that dimension, but then you also have these clandestine agents, which opens up the door to state terrorism, to states sponsoring acts of terror to advance their national interest. So, for example, here we have U.S. support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, acting against the USSR. U.S. support for Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, as Reagan compared them to the founding fathers in terms of his characterization of their role, given their religiosity, given their fight against the godless communists. That's how they were initially portrayed. But the reality is the CIA funded and trained them because they were the most vicious, dangerous individuals they could find their way to, and they pointed them basically at the Russians or the Soviets. Another instance of this, and this was actually tried at the International Court of Justice in the case of the Republic of Nicaragua versus the United States of America, a 1986 case of the International Court of Justice, where the United States, during the Reagan administration, was found guilty of supporting terrorism in Nicaragua, in their material support for the Contras, who they were using as a proxy against the Sandinista government, waged within the context of the ideological conflict of the Cold War. And the United States was also found guilty in that instance of mining a harbor in Nicaragua, placing mines in their sea harbor. That particular case was referred to the UN Security Council. So the United States was identified in that International Court of Justice as a state sponsor of terror. Of course, once it got to the Security Council, no action was taken because the United States holds a veto there. And when the sort of charges associated with that, the material compensation associated with that was dropped from the charges, Nicaragua dropped the charges themselves. But there we have an instance of a state sponsor of terror. Chomsky makes a great deal of this as to whether by focusing on lone wolves and these clandestine or these subnational groups, do we miss the real terrorism, which can be conducted by states as well?
Okay.
Yeah. Does that make some sense?
Yeah,
Okay,
by just saying, making any definition, we have to look at what, if they're identifying something, what are they not identifying?
Yeah.
Or what are they, not, what is it that they're legitimizing?
Yeah. So what forms of violence are legitimate and what forms of violence are terrorism? Even when it comes to the American occupation of Iraq, the Sunni insurgency and later the Shiite insurgency in Iraq was identified by the United States as acts of terrorism. But from an outside observer, you could say this is an armed insurgency against an occupying force. That would seem legitimized by the fact that the United States has no legitimate claim to govern Iraq, and you would expect the national population to rise up in arms against the occupier under those circumstances. So the language is clearly, it's politically charged language when we identify a group as a terrorist, and it's politically contested for that reason. Okay, I'd just like to end here with the kind of an obvious question, and that is whether, and I'm always cautious about this, have we made too big of a deal out of international terrorism? Does it really represent an existential threat to liberal democracies? I've tried to make the case earlier that the threat is to be understood in terms of what we do in response to that threat, more so than the attacks themselves. If you look at the violence done, and this is crude, but in terms of how many people are actually killed, in the case of that attack on Parliament Hill, we have one individual killed and the attacker themselves. You could look at motor vehicle accidents as being a much more dangerous thing, really, than that sort of politically motivated violence. The difference, of course, is that it is politically motivated compared to an accident or compared to someone dying because of a virus where there's no interest, there's no political objective whatsoever. There's something about that that makes it seem more important. That politically motivated violence is elevated above the more routine, if you will, kinds of violence that we encounter. Is it an existential threat to our state, our society, and our civilization? We can imagine alternative approaches to terrorism. You could simply say we can absorb these attacks and take on a stiff upper lip kind of attitude. If the Brits during the bombing of London can keep calm and carry on, why do we have to be so concerned? Why does the world have to change because of the September 11th attacks? The problem, of course, with that approach, just at the cold calculating level, you could say 3,000 people dead is terrible. Of course, the buildings can be rebuilt. Our society will not be undone because of this, but that doesn't play well politically. No.
Because the people who are just how our country was affected, and people were targeted for civilians, I think going back to security and protection that we provide, puts that into question. Well, what are we going to do? How are we going to be prevented? Like, what are we going to danger? Is there
Just on that point, though, let's compare road fatalities and acts of international terrorism. You say more people die as a result of road fatalities than die as a result of international terrorism. And there are things that states can do, very real things that states can do. We know that if you have safe cycling infrastructure, separated cycling paths that are well maintained, people don't die because they're hit by cars while riding their bicycles. But that doesn't seem to raise itself to the level of the security threats. You can identify an enemy. You can say, here's the bad guy. Yeah. And it's not us. It's those scary fellows over there. It's that big other. Yeah? The difficulty, I use the example of vehicle accidents involving pedestrians and cyclists. Part of the difficulty there is that we recognize that to the extent that we all drive here, someone just went for their driving license, we're all dangerous. We recognize the danger is us there. And there's a kind of personal accountability. Have we at some time looked at our phone while we're driving, knowing that that makes us as dangerous as if we were drunk while we were driving? Maybe we have, yeah? And so it's harder to then relocate that blame onto another and say, come on, state, protect me from those people. It would require that we adjust our own behaviors, which is always more challenging, yeah, in terms of assuming responsibility in that way.
Yeah, and I think that also characteristic of our settlement, our population, where we put responsibility, our responsibility when we, because it's a privilege to have a license, you're responsible to hold that license, you're responsible to follow the laws, and, the state can, of course, there's laws, crime, to prevent things from happening, but essentially you're behind that wheel. So you're taking, I guess there's like a contract when you sign that, like you have to take some liability. It's why there's insurance, it's why there's that's why we have courts, that's why we have, for all these, whatever could happen, disputes of anything.
And the challenge there again is that the danger is us, as opposed to the danger being some evil foreign other,
Yeah, and then one person, say one person does something that, I don't know, and then the whole country gets blamed. Like you're all responsible now because this one certain group, did a terrorism. The whole country blamed, and people that live in Canada or America who are from that country get targeted.
Sure, yeah, you see increased racial profiling domestically. You see hostile attitudes towards others. The Muslim ban, for example, in the United States was an instance of that. Yeah, painting whole groups with one brush. But that is an option. Again, politically it's difficult because the stiff upper lip approach is a difficult one because the political incentive is always to overreact. You can say that, well, it may have been too much to round up all the adult Muslim Arab men in New York, or it may have been too much to engage in domestic surveillance of American phone calls. It may have been too much to engage in extraordinary rendition. Guantanamo Bay, maybe we shouldn't have done that. But look, no more terrorist attacks on the scale of 9/11. But if you take a more moderate approach and say, that was terrible, but it didn't undo the very fabric of our society, and there's another attack, as a politician, you will be blamed. So the political incentive is to overreact in a way that vindicates the aims of the terrorists. To say that, look, the United States is hostile to Arab Muslims. We are the enemy and they are the enemy. It kind of feeds into that narrative. Yeah.
What is that called when you're countering terrorism? You do something really like that.
Well, counterterrorism, but what do you mean? Like,
So like the overreaction itself, besides just being an overreaction, or just a responsible reaction, what's another way you could say that?
you could say it's disproportionate. You could say it's indiscriminate to the extent that civilians become casualties. You know, the nighttime raids in Afghanistan, the use of drones. Would be indiscriminate. indiscriminate. And one of the fixtures of American foreign policy following this, after, during the Obama administration, was the use of targeted drone strikes that were permitted to be used against U.S. citizens as well as against foreign nationals. It's that kind of change, I think, that really compromises a country in terms of its response. The other option is to prosecute this as a crime using international institutions in international cooperation through intelligence sharing. Another option would be the containment and deterrence of rogue regimes that may be otherwise inclined to support international terrorism. Another approach would be an emphasis on human security as opposed to national security as a means of addressing the root causes of terrorism. Human security. Realizing that security doesn't mean just defending a nation's borders against external threats. Human security is the realization that to be secure means having access to clean air, clean drinking water, employment, a modicum of economic well-being. Those are the things that make human beings secure. And to the extent that there are vast swaths of the world's population living in very deep insecurity, you add animus to those terrorist groups. And then finally, there's the question of hard power versus soft power, and whether fighting a war of ideas that would buttress a rules-based international order, rather than a real war against an idea, the idea of terror, that would make for a perpetual war in an anarchic world.
I don't understand that last one. You said the hard power versus the soft power?
So we can approach this in terms of entering into a conflict, entering into a war on terror. That's one option. That was the option that was taken. Let's fight a war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and let's engage in a perpetual war, an endless war with no clearly defined battlefield where the fight could be taken anywhere. And those drone strikes are the key instrument of that aspect of the war on terror. That's one approach. Or we could say that we're fighting an idea here, basically. We're not fighting evildoers, although there are evildoers certainly involved. We need to come to terms with this idea and wage an effective response to it. We need to underline the importance of liberal democracy, of respect for universal human rights, of the importance of human security, and encourage states to provide just that, so as not to provide this sort of wellspring of support for these international terrorist actors. Wellspring of support. If our foreign policy, or if American foreign policy for that matter, makes people more insecure, creates failed states, then you have fertile breeding grounds for terrorism. It may be that the United States and its allies need to adjust their foreign policy to recognize that failed states do represent a real danger. States that cannot fulfill their responsibility to protect their own populations, whether they're vicious tyrannies or whether they're just incapable of governing, that represents a real threat to those people. And that threat to those people in that country cannot easily be isolated from our own security. That insecurity in another part of the world affects our security here too. Right? That may be one lesson that we can gather from these instances of international terrorism.
Well, that's not something that Americans can really affect us. In the world, these choices, like when you were saying the choices matter, that's how I understood it as well. Like in states, the choices that states make, no matter where they are in the world, those choices are being measured. Those choices are, there's an effect that happens amongst the populations, amongst the relationships between states. However, those are, working or not working. But essentially, it starts with that decision, that moment, and those decisions have an effect. And then it has sort of a ripple.
Yeah, and I think that could have been one lesson taken from September 11th. Again, to realize that insecurity on the far side of the planet affects us, that we cannot isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. That could engender, as this pandemic or as global climate change could engender a sense that our fates are intertwined with one another, that we need to cooperate, that we cannot wall ourselves off from these sorts of new threats facing sovereign states. I think our options here are either greater cooperation and a rules-based international order on the one hand, or this hard sovereigntist position on the other, which argues that states can do whatever they so choose to advance their interests in their national security.
Is that also like sort of a position of realism and idealism?
It is, yeah, yeah,
That's exactly what
it is, yeah. And I think here the idealist position is more realistic, frankly. The proof of that is the endlessness of the war on terror. Now, the architects of it knew that it would be a perpetual war with no well-defined battle lines. Who would choose such a thing? I think that cooperation, that international institutions like the International Criminal Court would be appropriate means of addressing these threats, whereas the war on terror has shown itself to be remarkably ineffective at advancing that same end. We are not more secure as a result of that. And then further to that, we should be broadening our conception of security beyond that failed effort to secure the territorial boundaries of states to address the roots of human insecurity, not only within our own country, but the world over. That's only through that we can make ourselves more secure. We can only beat this pandemic here in North America if we beat it in Africa too. It's a very similar kind of threat assessment where we have these new threats: international terrorism, environmental catastrophe, pandemics that just don't respect territorial borders. It's as clear as this. That forces us to cooperate on a scale that we hitherto have not. There seems to be a real urgency associated with that right now.
So one quick question about, if I have time.
Sure.
When you said that they were closing the borders what about, what was the concern for Africa? That there was a limit on communication, or was it?
Well, yeah. So the concern there is first that it sort of perpetuates this walled-off state version of security, as if we could seal off our borders and keep that danger outside somehow. Clearly, we can't. Just practically, it's here. Sorry, yeah. And so, yeah. So in terms of relations between states, South Africa has come forward saying, look, we're very forthcoming. We're very transparent about this. And this might produce a disincentive to do this kind of thing, to come forward and say, look, we've identified this new variant, and we're letting you know because it's coming your way. You could just then, they're damaged by this. They're heavily reliant upon tourism as a part of their economy. They may say in the future, other states may say in the future, we don't want to be sealed off from the rest of the world. We'll just sit on our hands here and wait, and you'll see it. We could have seen this first coming out of Canada, knowing that it's here now, just days after the announcement was made. We could be entirely unclear as to where the geographic origins really were, if states were not forthcoming in terms of divulging the information that they had and aiming to cooperate within the auspices here of the WHO. So those states suddenly become kind of pariah states that we're trying to seal off from the rest of the world as if they are the source of contagion. And then there's a racist dimension that becomes associated with that potentially too. That's partly why the WHO has been identifying these variants in terms of the Greek alphabet. It's not a particularly illuminating way, but for those of us who may not know the Greek alphabet in terms of public health messaging, there's that whole question. But the reason they didn't call it the Wuhan virus was because, as Trump wanted to, or the China virus, was because that would associate the virus with those people. Interestingly, sidebar, and I'm not making any claims to be an epidemiologist here, but just the political history of the Spanish flu, for example, is illuminating in that regard. We call it the Spanish flu because it was first identified in Spain. And the reason it was first identified in Spain was because Spain was a non-belligerent in World War I, and they had a free press at the time. And there was not an effective free press in the United States. They knew that the virus was in the United States, but didn't want to diminish the war effort, diminish the morale of the soldiers by saying, you may all get sick as a result of this mobilization. So news of it amongst the belligerents was suppressed. Only where they had a free press in Spain did the news get out, and so we say Spanish flu, even though it likely did not have its origins there. So it's politicized, eh? The naming of things attributes a kind of meaning, a significance to them, and then you can point a finger and assign blame. And so that's part of the concern here, too, is that if we associate these outbreaks with particular countries or particular regions, it may get in the way of international cooperation and may dissuade states from being forthcoming with the information that they have. That's the concern. And then there's their own practical concern about their tourism industry. That's their motivation there. They want to say that we acted in good faith, and so you should too. I haven't heard any epidemiologists saying that the solution to this is to start reenacting hard borders at the state level. They're saying, again, it's here, there, and everywhere. And so we need to think about the public health measures that we've been taking already: vaccines, masks, physical distancing. We're back to that. But fingers crossed. Let's hope that the vaccines work on that front. Let's get our boosters when it's our time. Congratulations there for being first in line.
I'm surprised I had known my first reaction.
Excellent.
This is